Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Top 10 Tips for Fruit Tree Care webinar, which is hosted by the Roseville Utility Exploration Center. My name is Braden Mitchell, and I'm the Senior Interpretive Services Specialist at the Utility Exploration Center. For those of you who may not know us, we're part of our utility departments here in Roseville. All of our utilities are municipally owned and operated. Those include solid waste, stormwater, wastewater, electric, and drinking water. The Utility Exploration Center is a one-of-a-kind environmental learning center focused on bringing all visitors information on protecting our natural resources. Our topics include energy efficiency, renewable technology, recycling, waste reduction, and of course, water conservation. We offer school programs, events, a free visitor center, workshops, and webinars like this one. Unfortunately, our visitor center is closed right now, but when we do reopen, which will hopefully be soon, I do invite all of you to come by and explore Roseville's utilities with us, because together we can help build a sustainable community. Now, before we launch into our webinar topic today, I want to go over just a few housekeeping things. First of all, our webinar is going to be recorded today, and we will put that recording up on our webpage in probably about a week from now. And that website is roseville.ca.us/explore. Also on that same website, we will have a link to this presentation. So we'll have all these slides available for you to download and peruse at your leisure. Now, for you guys that are out there watching, we do have a question and answer field. So if you would like to ask some questions today, and I encourage you to do so, in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, where that red circle is on my screen, you should see a little question box. Once you click that, it'll open up this side panel, and down at the very bottom where it says ask a question, you can click that button and type in your question. Now, you do also have the ability of adding your name on there. That is completely up to you. We would love it if you asked any questions that you do have. We'll try our best to reserve a little bit of time at the end of the webinar today for some questions for Kevin to answer those out loud. But if we don't get to everybody's question, we will download all of these questions and put up our answer sheet to those on that same web page. Again, that's roseville.ca.us/explore. Now, of course, today we have a great special guest. Our presenter is Kevin Marini. Now, Kevin is the Master Gardener Program Manager for both Placer and Nevada counties, and he's been in that role for about 18 years. Some of you might even recognize Kevin as our local worm whisperer. Now, that's a whole nother webinar that I'm sure we'll get into eventually. But he's got some great information for you guys today, talking specifically about fruit trees. So, Kevin, are you about ready? All right. Turn it over to you, sir.
All right. First off, I obviously want to say thank you to Roseville Utility Exploration Center for partnering with the Master Gardener program to be able to give these classes and webinars now, classes in person in the past. So thanks, guys, for having me and inviting me to do this. As Braden said, I manage 2 Master Gardener programs through our University of California Cooperative Extension Office. We cover 2 counties, Placer and Nevada counties. We have an office in Auburn and an office in Grass Valley. Both, of course, are closed at the moment, but we're doing things like this to still reach people and get our education out there into the public. So now, obviously, I'm still I've presented for 18 years to huge audiences, but I have no idea who you are out there. I don't know my audience because I can't see you. So I have tried to do a presentation that, kind of strikes the middle ground where not too basic and not too technical, right? But obviously there's going to be, in the short amount of time, I'm not going to be able to cover everything. It won't be completely comprehensive. So do ask those questions if you have it. I'll have a resource page at the end with my email and other further resources. So that's important. And also be aware that we are a research-based organization, science-based organization. So, but there's exception to almost every rule in gardening. So if you hear something that perplexes you, follow up on it, because you may have a different experience that worked for you. But again, we're trying to give recommendations based on research, right? So that works for everybody, no matter where they are. So that's my little intro. Let's get going, and we're going to go fast because there's so much information in a small amount of time. So here we go. Let's get started. So these are my top 10 tips, and we're going to count down from 10. And the first one is be a master fruit tree steward. And that seems like maybe a strange thing to say, but there is a program in Seattle that I kind of stole that from. And they, like the Master Gardener program, where volunteers are trained and then volunteer to do education outreach. The Master Fruit Tree Steward program in Seattle trains people to take care of fruit trees all over the city, and they volunteer to do so. And so in that same vein, I ask that you think about stewarding your fruit trees if you're going to go forward and plant them, because we have local farmers that rely on their orchards for their subsistence, and it would be too bad if somehow a pest or disease became prevalent in our area and took down, let's say, our mountain mandarin industry, right? So citrus is really what I'm focused on here. You can see on the picture below the fruit trees there, the orange tree, that's the Asian citrus psyllid, which we're on the lookout here in Placer and Nevada counties for. So being very good about taking care of your fruit trees if you're going to plant them, and monitoring for pests and disease is so important, not just for your fruit tree, but for everybody else's fruit tree and even our commercial orchards out there. Okay, they're hoping that home gardeners pay attention to their fruit trees and identify pests or disease so that we don't get into a situation where something has spread from home to our commercial orchards. So a good thing to do is, if you have real sick fruit trees, you inherited some ailing trees that are barely producing and look horrible, remove them, get that inoculum out of there. If you have a fruit tree that just has never produced, the kindest cut may be at the bottom for that type of situation, okay? And then whenever you're planting a fruit tree, learn about the pests that affect those types of trees. For example, apples and pears get fire blight, which is very difficult to deal with. So if you know what you're looking for, you're going to be more likely to actually observe it and make note of it, right? So number 10, be a master fruit tree steward. Next. Now, when you're selecting fruit trees, the temptation is to go to the nursery and look around and read the labels and go, this sounds just wonderful, I want it. And in most cases, as a plant fanatic, I'd say, more power to you. But when it comes to fruit trees, it's really good to think a little bit about really, and be honest with yourself, really and truly, what am I going to eat? So if you have a family that really doesn't like to eat figs, then don't plant a fig tree, okay? Plant what you're going to eat. And within that, let's say you love apples. Let's just go with this picture here. See all the different varieties there. So if you love apples, experiment within the apple varieties, because there's so many, okay? If you start experimenting with fruits that you're never going to eat, I can almost guarantee you they will get less care than the ones that you like to eat. So you can actually now look at different varieties that come to fruition, pun intended, at different times, so that you could have an apple harvest that spans an entire month by having different varieties ripening at different times. So if you love apples, experiment within the varieties there and the harvest times, okay? Now, obviously with fruit trees, any fruiting plant, you need sun. And at the very minimum, 6 hours of sun, full sun, is what's recommended for fruit trees. There may be some varieties that do better in more filtered sun or shady situations, but my recommendation to you is sun, 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 as much as you can get. I know that in small lots, you may be limited in that way, but you're not going to get a beautiful harvest of tasty fruit without the sunshine, okay? Now, chill hours are the number of hours between 32 degrees and 45 degrees that a certain variety may need to actually break dormancy and make fruit. There's a lot of that's a very simple and straightforward way to explain it. But basically, the upshot is make sure that the fruit tree you're buying has can actually grow in your area. Okay, so certain apples need a lot of chill hours and can only be grown in higher elevations where they get those chill hours, where they get all those hours between 32 degrees and 45 degrees. So in areas like Lincoln, Roseville, Penn Valley, our lower elevation areas, you may not be able to grow certain varieties of fruit trees because you don't get enough chill hours. That information is available through our Master Gardener office or online in many places as well. Now, microclimates. Look around and get to know your property so that you can find where there are cold pockets and warm pockets, right? So, for example, I live on a north-facing hill, and at the top of that hill, I get a lot warmer temperatures than at the bottom, right? Because cold air drains down. So if I'm trying to protect a fruit tree, I'm going to put it on the upper part of my property rather than the lower, right? So that's just one basic example of a microclimate. Get to know your property, get to know your lot, and figure out where the most sun is, if there's any wet spots, if there's dry spots, if there's an area where it looks like there's bare soil where nothing is growing. That's weird if nothing's growing there. So get to know your yard as well as the different varieties and things and what they need to grow. Now, most of this presentation is based on planting fruit trees in the ground. It would be kind of a whole nother presentation to just talk about container, but you definitely can grow certain fruit trees in containers, and a lot of people do this with citrus, so oranges and limes and all those good citrus trees. Using a wider rather than deeper, so you don't want a real narrow, deep container for a fruit tree. What you want is a wide, like a wine barrel type situation where you have a lot of width to the container and not a whole lot of depth, because of course those roots go out laterally. They're in a narrow container, they're just going to spin around and slowly girdle themselves. And so citrus is probably a good option for containers, and I would say genetic dwarf as far as other fruit trees would work in a container. Genetically dwarfed fruit trees can be maintained in a container-like situation. Now, when I get a lot of questions about growing fruit trees from seed, and it's not that you couldn't do that, it's just that you don't necessarily know what you're going to get, right? So when you take that peach pit off of the John Muir peach and you plant it, you're not going to get a John Muir peach. You're going to get a genetic scramble, and you don't really know what you're going to get. However, you may get something awesome. So I don't necessarily discourage people from doing it, but I also want people to be very knowledgeable that you could get something that is inedible. Okay, so if you want to be sure what you're planting and what you're going to harvest, don't plant from seed. Okay, next. So this slide just kind of is a list of considerations when you're about to select a fruit tree. So like I said, it's so tempting to be spontaneous, go to a nursery, walk around and read those labels and go, oh, I want this one, I want this one, I want this one. But really, before you do that, at least kind of run through these questions. Okay, what do you like to eat? How much space do you have? How much work are you willing to put in? Certain types of fruit trees are way more work than others. Okay, pollination. Do you actually, will one tree work for you? Is it self-fruitful, or do you actually need another tree to pollinize it? And then does that cause problems with space? So that needs to be a upfront consideration. The growth habit of the fruit tree. So can you take this fruit tree and make it into something that will work for your space? A good example of that is taking an apple tree and pruning it in an espalier fashion up against a wall, something like that, to really maximize space, still get apples, right? Rather than having it out in the middle of the yard, 10 by 10, right? That's just an example. Certain fruit trees are better at espalier than others. So that's what I mean by understanding the growth habit and the vigor of the type of fruit tree you're going to plant. Climate, that's important. Knowing you know, how cold it gets on your property, especially citrus. We really don't recommend planting citrus in the ground above, you know, 1,200 to 1,500 feet. If you do, you're going to have to protect it for sure. So that's an example of how your local conditions can affect what you can plant, right? And then, of course, what pests are in the area? What types of pests, insect pests, and microbial diseases occur around here that you're likely going to have to deal with? If you can just answer those questions before you jump into picking and selecting a fruit tree, you'll be better off. Thanks. Next. Now, this number 8, always plant bare root fruit trees. It's bare root fruit tree season right now. The nurseries are stocked with them. They're, because of the demand with the whole COVID thing, they're selling out fast. Because I'm a certified arborist and I'm very familiar with the data out there on tree mortality, and it's very clear to me that trees should be planted in a bare root fashion. And even though I'm talking specifically about fruit trees, I kind of mean every tree, because it's the only way to actually look at the root system and determine if it's uncompromised and going to actually live when you plant it. When you plant a containerized tree, you can't see the roots. And many times the tree itself is planted too deep in the container. And so it's a double whammy where it's ends up being planted too deep and the roots are compromised. And so when they do the post-mortem on some of these trees that suddenly die, what do they find? Compromised root systems, right? Or crown rot, root rot, because the tree was planted too deep. Bare root just skirts past those issues because you can see the root system, you can prune dead roots off, you can flare the roots out in the planting hole to make sure it's not going to circle. Plant bare root, even if that means taking the containerized tree and washing off all the nursery media. That's not actually soil. That's a man-made product, okay? All that potting soil. And so wash all that off, look at the root system, and then you can plant it the right height, and you can flare out those roots, and you won't have tree death, early tree death, right? So the bare root fruit tree is characterized by not just its bare roots, but also the fact that you have a scion, a top part, and a rootstock, a bottom part. And in the picture on the right-hand side, you can see very clearly where that graft union is. You'll see the rootstock comes out of the ground about 4 to 5 inches, and then you can see the graft of the scion right there. That union absolutely has to be out of the ground. If it's buried, it's going to die. So the other thing that can happen is that graft union could potentially fail completely if it's buried underground, and it would die that way as well. So understand that you are getting the variety you want on the top, but the rootstock is a completely different type of variety. And therefore, you never want sprouts to grow from that rootstock and take over the top part of the tree. This happens with citrus trees all the time, where someone says, I got this weird fruit on my citrus tree. It's likely the rootstock has taken over, because most of those varieties are not chosen for their sweet tasting fruit. In some cases, they're not even edible. So this is important to understand where that graft union is. If you don't know where it is on your fruit trees and you already planted them, go out and find it. Next. As you can see here, here's a picture of a bunch of fruit trees potted up in containers. I don't know if those are, I think those are fruit trees. And so what happens is, at the end of bare root season, a lot of the nurseries will plant their bare roots in containers like this. And as you can imagine, there are these huge root systems that get stuffed into a container. And what happens, the roots just go round and round and round and round. And so when they get planted in the ground like that, and you can go around, the best place to see this is in any parking lot where trees are planted, because you can go to any parking lot and look at the base of the tree, and what you'll see is that picture on the right where the plant is dying very gradually and slowly as the roots girdle around and basically suffocate the tree, and it dies. Those roots never go out into the soil. They just continue to remain compromised. So ideally, you always want to plant bare root, any tree, to be honest with you. But also, if you're gonna plant, you buy a tree in a container, like I said before, you got to get rid of this situation by washing off all the soil and correcting it before you put it into the ground. Next. So when it comes to soil, a lot of people think that in the foothills we have bad soil, and that's really a myth. You know, we have clay soil is great. It holds a lot of water and it holds a lot of nutrients, and that's a good thing, as opposed to sandy soil, which, you know, doesn't hold water and doesn't hold nutrients. So the good news is that we have clay soils in the majority of the areas of the foothills. There definitely are some sandy soils, especially in lower elevations. So we recommend planting the fruit tree in native soil with no fertilizers and no amendments, unless dictated by a soil analysis. So the only way you could possibly know what's in your soil is by getting to know it through a lab soil analysis, through a soil texture by field test, and through a drainage test. So if you don't do these things and you're adding things to your soil, you're doing it completely out of guesswork. You have no idea if it actually, the plant needs the fertilizer or not, if the soil is deficient in this nutrient or not. You know, you don't know the pH, you don't know the organic matter percentage. And these are crucial pieces of data to have in order to make the right decisions. If you get a soil analysis and it says you're very deficient in this, and that, well, then it makes sense to add those amendments to the soil prior to the planting of the tree, because you know you're deficient. But if you don't know you're deficient, it makes no sense whatsoever to add anything to that planting hole whatsoever. Okay, so a soil analysis, you know, is done through a lab. There are many of them, and plenty of resources online to get that done. The soil texture by field test, again, you can go online and get instructions. The Natural Resource Conservation Service has instructions on that, and that's a simple way to figure out, okay, is my soil, you know, clay based? Is it sand based? Is it sandy loam? Is it clay loam? Where does it fall into the spectrum of soil textures? And that will help inform you of how to treat that soil, especially when it comes to drainage. So the drainage test is you know, like a simple perk test of digging a hole in the ground, filling it full of water, and timing how long it takes to drain. That gives you an idea of the drainage in your situation. If there's one thing that fruit trees don't want, is to be sitting in wet soil. Okay, so even though you need a water to grow good fruit, if you have a perpetual poor draining wet soil, the tree will die. Okay, over time, might take a little bit, it will not work. So good drainage is important. You want to remove all the existing plants around. You don't want, especially the perennial weeds, right? So if you have Bermuda grass and you have other vicious perennial weeds, you really want to remove them before you're planting. This is another reason why I don't like planting fruit trees in lawns, because you're constantly fighting the turf, trying to infiltrate around the fruit tree, and we want space around the fruit tree. We don't want grass growing up to it. Okay. A good thing to know too is the history of the soil. You know, is what you're dealing with in your backyard, you know, subsoil that somehow got moved there and compacted? Is it, you know, we live in an area where there were apples and pears all over the place, and lead arsenate was sprayed like crazy. And so, you know, it was your area where you're about to plant 50 fruit trees, you know, your soil filled with arsenic because of all the lead arsenate that got sprayed. You know, those are the type. That's what I mean by soil history. And in my resources section at the end, you'll see I have a link to what's called the Web Soil Survey. And what they did, the Resource Conservation Service, is they took all the actual hard copy soil sampling and they put it into this online module, so you can actually put in your address and get some information about the soil right in your backyard through through that online tool. That's pretty cool. Next. I have to keep going. We got a lot of info. Okay. Oh, there we go. Number 6, plant the fruit tree with care. Obviously, this is the most important part of getting your fruit tree off to a good start. So you're going to dig a wide but not deep hole. The last thing you want is that fruit tree to settle below grade, right? No, no, no. We want drainage, drainage, drainage. You want it, if anything, above grade or at grade, okay? So wide but not deep, okay? And then you actually want to create a little pedestal in there, like you can see in the picture, that your fruit tree sits on top, and then you flare the roots out around it, okay? In this way, that ensures the fruit tree is on a strong foundation, so it's not going to settle, but it also allows those roots to immediately flare out and go out and not girdle around. Super important. Remember that graft union needs to be above the ground about 3 to 4 inches. You can see it above the shovel handle in the picture on the right there. Now you refill it with native soil, no fertilizers. When if anything, you've made amendments to the soil area based on a soil analysis, but if you, in the absence of that analysis, don't add any amendments, no fertilizers to that planting hole. Okay, get it off to a strong start, make it get used to the native soil. You don't want to dig a hole and fill it with all this potting mix or soil conditioner or compost and have the tree just spin its roots around there. You just created a big container, okay? And over time, that's not going to be beneficial for the fruit tree, okay? You fill it with native soil and then mulch on top, water in well, and then whitewashing has to do with mixing water in a 50-50 manner with interior latex white or other light colored paint, and you paint that fruit tree. I know it sounds crazy, but I'm sure people have seen white fruit trees around and wondered why are they doing that, and it's for sunburn protection. So one of the things that immediately causes problems with fruit trees is when the bark gets sunburned, splits, and then it's just a wide open door for insects and disease. So whitewashing is super important, especially at planting. Now the wiggle test in the bottom right there. What is the wiggle test? So if you plant a fruit tree and within 1 year that fruit tree is still wiggling and isn't solidly rooted, guess what? Dig it up and replant it. So the wiggle test is a way to gauge if that tree actually put roots down and is now anchored into the soil. And if it's not, something's wrong after a year. Either there's some air pockets in there, either there was too much settling, either a gopher ate all the roots, I don't know, something happened. And that wiggle test gives you a great gauge of that. And this could be obviously done with ornamental tree, any tree you plant. You want to practice that wiggle test. Next. Now, one of the points of contention when it comes to planting fruit trees is whether or not to prune at planting or not. So I am of the mindset that I recommend keeping your fruit trees as small as possible for proper care. Once a fruit tree gets big, it becomes really difficult to actually take care of it well. You just can't reach everything. You can't monitor everything well. It becomes harder to pick the fruit, harder to prune. You want to, if possible, not have to even get on a ladder to deal with your fruit trees. Dave Wilson Nursery, I have to give them some credit here. Ed Livo, the guru of the small fruit trees. So I'm sure the trend was started before that, but they really popularized it. Ed Livo at Dave Wilson is just an amazing guy. He has a lot of videos on YouTube. And so he teaches our Master Gardener training class on fruit trees. And he's absolutely convinced me to keep these fruit trees small. And the way you do it is you make that cut at planting at your knee height. And that will allow you to then choose the scaffold branches that grow out of that short height and allow you to develop good structure from the very beginning. So the idea that you want a big fruit tree from the nursery, you don't. It doesn't matter. Okay, I would actually say err on the side, get a smaller one. So you don't need the biggest, caliper fruit tree. You don't need a 6 foot, 7 foot tall fruit tree to start because you're going to cut it at the knees anyways to make sure the structure is well done from the very beginning. Next. Number 5, water wisely and fruitfully. Obviously, we're in a situation right now, we haven't had a lot of rain and we have some warm weather coming, so it's very pertinent to be talking about this at this moment. I have found, and I've been doing this for, like I said, 18 years, but I've been helping people with their veggie and fruit orchards, veggie gardens and fruit orchards for upwards of 22, 23 years. And I mean, if the one thing I can say is I've diagnosed literally thousands of problems in my career here in Placer and Nevada counties. And watering is the main issue, okay, with plants not doing well. And many times it's overwatering, but it can also be underwatering. So when it comes to trees, there's so many times where folks will put an emitter next to a small little planting, and as it gets bigger, they never add any irrigation to it. And as you can see on the picture on the left, you have to add irrigation as the tree grows. So using its drip line, if you take the edge of its leaves and go straight down, that's kind of the width you're shooting for. So when it's young, yeah, you're just going to have a tiny little circle, maybe a soaker hose around it, no big deal. But as it gets bigger, you have to expand that and you have to give it more water. So UC Davis, has recognized that watering, watering trees and shrubs is challenging for folks. So they actually developed something called the TRIC, the Tree Ring Irrigation Contraption. And it's a kit, and it really is good for home gardeners planting fruit trees to have something they can go to. Again, it's in my resources page at the very end here, so you'll be able to go right to it and see what it's all about. But the general idea is what you see in the picture on the right there of creating layered drip irrigation around the tree from the inside spanning out to the drip line. And in general, very general, a mature fruit tree takes 15 to 16 gallons a day during the growing season, but you cannot use those types of numbers as your only guide to how much to water. You need to get to know your soil. You need to dig down after you water with a shovel, of course away from the roots if you can, and get an idea of how much is soaking into the soil at what depth. That will give you an idea of how much to water. You actually figure out in your yard how much to water. You don't necessarily get a formula. There are formulas that can guide you and get you started, but in general, it's your own experience that's going to refine how much you water. Next. We always recommend using mulch, and we recommend putting it all the way out to the drip line. And I know that I just said I don't like putting fruit trees in lawns a couple slides ago, and I still don't, even though this slide has pictures of them in lawns. But as you can see, there's a defined area around the tree where there's no competition with the turf, and that's essential to healthy fruit trees. I love using arborist wood chips, which is a combination usually of dead and live material that you spread on top that slowly composts over time. And as compost forms on the soil surface underneath the mulch layer, it feeds the tree with nutrients. And it helps create a very vibrant soil biology under that area too. So in one sense, I would say as long as you keep up with good cultural care of the tree above ground and you keep mulch on the ground and you water correctly, you're never going to have to use fertilizer for your fruit trees. Remember, mulch is not compost and compost is not mulch. Next. Be patient with insect pests. So, the first things that come out in the spring are insect pests, because how can the beneficial insects that eat them come out first if there's no food, right? So the first thing that has to come out is the food. And so the aphids come out so that then the beneficials can come in and eat the aphids. And if you jump in the middle there and take care of the aphids, you're impatient with it, guess what? Those beneficials won't come around because then again, there's no food. So whether it's a ladybug eating aphids or parasitic wasps taking care of aphids, there's lots of beneficial insects. We have a great book, the UC A&R book, Natural Enemies. A lot of that now is online in our UCIPM site. You see the address there. It's in the resources as well. But it's very, very key to be patient with pests and don't immediately jump out there and spray the most toxic pesticide. Okay, you start with the least toxic method and work your way up. But even so, when you first see those few aphids, it might not be the time yet. Monitor the population. Okay, there are commercial orchards have thresholds, right? When certain counts on a leaf get above a threshold, then they treat. So they're not just treating right away, okay? Because when you do that, you knock out the beneficials as well. Next. Just because I said that doesn't mean you can't do some preventative things to help you out when it comes to insect pests or microbial pests like bacterial and fungal diseases. So in the upper left, you see a picture of fire blight, which is brutal in this area for apples and pears. On the right-hand side at the top, you see a picture of peach leaf curl, right? Most people who have peaches know exactly what that is. On the bottom left, you see scab on apple. On the bottom right, you see scale that ants will actually protect. Scale are these sucking insects that you'll find on stems of your trees, and the ant will be harvesting the honeydew that they produced and protecting them from predators. So in this case, these are tough things to manage when you actually see them, because there's really nothing you can do at that point except prune them out and dispose of it, right? Now the scale you could treat with horticultural oil pretty much year round. But the key is in the dormant season, you can do what's called dormant spraying on your fruit trees to help prevent some of this stuff. The general rule of thumb is to use a horticultural oil and a copper-based pesticide, and you use both of them, right? So the horticultural oil is smothering overwintering insects, and the copper is helping with things like peach leaf curl and scab and these bacterial fungal diseases. So there's a ton of information on dormant sprays on our home orchard website. Again, that's going to be in our resource page. So be aware, you are going to have to be actively pest managing your fruit tree. But when the fruit trees are dormant and have no leaves on them, you are still taking some action in the form of dormant spraying to prevent certain disease and pest outbreaks. Next. So number 3, this is a tough one. Okay, you have to have the courage to thin your fruit. And this is really difficult because most people, when they see a bunch of fruit on a tree, they are absolutely thrilled about that. And I am too, and everyone should be. But the problem is that usually will lead to subpar fruit and or complete breakage of branches, which can really hurt your fruit tree's overall health and structure. So thinning your fruit, believe it or not, is one of the most important things you can do to help maintain good fruit quality and maintain the structure of your fruit tree. So the other thing is some fruit trees, like apples, will bear very heavily one year and very light the next year. This is called biennial bearing. And this can be evened out by thinning your fruit as well. So for all those reasons that you see on the slide there, have the courage to thin your fruit. And now you're probably thinking, well, how much do I have to thin? Next slide, please. The rule of thumb and pinky is that you can use your thumb and pinky to determine the space between fruit. Now, of course, that's a very, informal way of doing it, but it actually works out pretty good. You can see in the picture on the right there of the fruit thinning in peach. Look at how much fruit you would have to take off to get to the proper distance between the fruits. Quite a bit, and I know that's difficult for a lot of people, but the benefits outweigh what could happen, right? That whole branch could break, you get no fruit, and you just compromise the structure of the tree. Now, in some cases where you have apples that bear on spurs in groups like this, it can be a little bit difficult to do the thinning. And in some cases, you don't have to. For example, cherries also bear from spurs in these clusters, and cherry fruit's so small and lightweight that you don't really have to thin cherries, okay? But apples, absolutely. Peaches, absolutely. Big fruit, absolutely. Next. Now, use the right tools for the job. This is so crucial when it comes to fruit trees. So first, I know that's not the best picture in the upper left because you can't completely see the orchard ladder, but I 100% recommend never getting on a regular ladder in any way, shape, or form out in your yard when tending to fruit trees. Either keep your tree small enough that you don't need a ladder, that's ideal. But if you absolutely need a ladder, buy an orchard ladder, which is specifically going to give you a much safer ladder to work from, okay? You can see this gentleman also has a fruit picking basket. Oh, he's hands-free. So you don't want to be holding something in one hand on a ladder and picking fruit, and next thing you know, you have no connection to the ladder, right? So those are two very important tools, especially if you have a lot of fruit trees. Bypass pruners, not the anvil type pruners. You want bypass that you can continually sharpen and keep clean for nice, sharp, clean cuts. You can take these pruners apart and keep them nice and clean and functioning properly for decades. Having a good pair of loppers is essential, and also a really nice pruning saw. I like the kinds that fold up because the ones that just are always have the saw always exposed seem to be probably a little more dangerous than the ones you can fold up and put away, right? So these are the basic tools. The backpack sprayer, of course, would only be necessary if you have multiple fruit trees, enough to necessitate a backpack sprayer. You could use a small pump sprayer, handheld, if you just had a few fruit trees. But having a dedicated sprayer for dormant sprays is really nice, and it makes it really much easier, and you get much better and more efficient coverage. Next. I'm bumping up here against the end. Okay, we got to number one, prune with a purpose. And like, obviously this whole class could just be on fruit tree pruning. So I'm gonna give you the main things. The most important part of pruning is understanding the different cuts. So first, a heading cut in the upper left-hand corner there. In general, when people in the industry think of heading cuts, they think of just a random cut anywhere to head off a branch, okay? And what that causes, if you don't take any care in where that cut is a whirl of growth right below that cut, which and then you have to go back and prune that whirl out because they're all weakly attached, or not all of them, that most of them are. And so you rarely ever use a heading cut when pruning your fruit trees unless you're specifically making a cut right above a bud that you want to direct in one way or another. So you have a bud and you're making a heading cut right above that bud to then force the bud to go out that way. So you're directing a branch. In that sense, it may be an appropriate cut. A thinning cut is taking the branch off at its origin, all the way back where it comes to the trunk, okay? And you will probably do a fair amount of thinning cuts as the tree, flushes out growth. So that's a very common cut to use. And then you have the reduction cut, where it's a much bigger cut, usually, reducing to a lateral branch. So the heading cut in general is sometimes called a bench cut to a bud, whereas the reduction cut is cutting back to a existing branch, okay, a lateral branch. You basically are going to prune your fruit trees now for overall structure, but for size control, keeping the fruit tree small, most of that pruning is going to be done in the summer by cutting back huge vigorous shoots and not letting that tree get out of control. Very important, avoid pruning cherries and apricots in the winter. Both cherries and apricots are prone to bacterial cankers and eutypa fungus, eutypa disease, which is when you have rain hitting fresh pruning wounds. And so don't prune cherries and apricots in the winter when it's the rainy time. Prune them in the summer. Obviously, if we have an entire month when there's no rain, you could get away with pruning them, but we rarely have that. So next. So dormant summer pruning, here's a great picture to give you an idea. Both are dormant pruned to remain. These are peach trees. The one on the left has been summer pruned. The one on the right has not. So they're dormant pruned for their structure, but as you can see, they still can get huge just by putting on a bunch of vigorous growth. But on the right, all those whips of vigorous growth have not been cut off, but on the left, they have been cut off. So see how you can control the size of the tree by making those heading cuts in the summer. You're going to go back during the dormant season and clean them up, but the heading cut in the summer is just to not allow that fruit tree to get oversized. So you do your dormant for structure, your summer for size control. Very important. Next. Here's some different pruning structures. So you have a central leader system like the two on the left, and then you have an open vase system, the two on the right. I can't get into much detail about that because I'm up against time. With citrus, you don't prune citrus trees very much at all. But one thing you do want to do is skirt prune citrus. So you don't want any of its branches laying on the ground. Okay, so skirt pruning is a pretty much across the board thumbs up when it comes to citrus. Next. So for year-round pruning, you can go by these four rules will really help you just in general, okay? Anytime you see a dead branch, you can prune it off. Any time of year. You see a dead branch, cut it off, okay? Anytime you have branches that are growing towards the inside of the tree, you can cut them off, okay? You want the airflow through trees. You don't want it to be, completely dense and entangled in the middle. So by cutting off those branches that are going towards the middle, you maintain that. Rubbing branches. You never want to allow rubbing branches to continue to rub, or they will cause damage, and then insects and microbial diseases can enter into those wounds. So another thing, no brainer. Oh, they're rubbing, pick one, cut the other one off, okay? And then suckers, vigorous, pure vertical shoots that come off of lateral branches or that come from the rootstock. A lot of times those are called water sprouts or suckers, or maybe the ones on the branches are called water sprouts a lot. Anyway, whatever you want to call them, you can take those off, no problem. So here are 4 things that you can absolutely do year-round to keep your fruit tree, structurally sound and to help it be healthy. Next. So just be aware, again, this gets a little complex, but different types of fruit trees fruit in different ways. So you can see on the far left, a leaf bud on the apple tree is right at the bottom there, whereas the flower bud on the spur is up at the top. They look totally different. So be able to identify what is a flower bud on a spur that's going to create your fruit versus a leaf bud. If you cut off all your spurs, you're not going to have any fruit, right? So here's another picture in the middle of a pear tree with spurs. Those will all push out clusters of flowers that will be your fruit production, okay? On the right, a plum, look at all those little spurs. And there's weird stuff where you have like peaches that fruit on 1-year-old wood. And so if you cut your peach all the way back where you don't have any 1-year-old wood, guess what? You're not going to have any peaches. So be aware that whatever type of fruit tree you pick, you should learn about the structures that lead to flowering and fruit so that you don't prune them off and then wonder, why don't I have any fruit? Next. This is, I believe, the final slide. I know I'm a little bit over. So be aware that there are certain types of fruit trees that require a lot less maintenance and pruning and others that require a lot more. This is just a simple, not comprehensive list of the ones that kind of fall into either category. It's not that you can't prune a pomegranate. It's just that its natural shape is such that it doesn't need a lot of pruning and still does really well and stays healthy. And citrus is another one that just doesn't require a lot of pruning. Not that you can't prune it, but normally you don't need to do a lot, as opposed to these vigorous ones on the right, especially peach, apricot, nectarine, plums. They grow vigorously. You're going to be doing summer pruning on those. Next, here is the resource page. I know that was an extremely quick presentation. Hopefully you got some good information, and here's all the follow-up for you, okay? All these different websites have great information. You see, I have a Placer County Master Gardener page, Nevada County Master Gardener page. Depending on what county you live in, go to those pages to really get hyper-local information. My email's on here. I'm open to having people ask me questions over email. That's totally cool, especially right now when we're not doing a lot of in-person education outreach. And then normally we don't really talk about commercial nurseries or commercial sites as a UC program, but it's really important to let you guys know that we live in California. And so, most of the fruit trees you're going to find at nurseries were grown at, Dave Wilson Nursery. And a lot of the citrus you find in this area were grown at Four Winds Growers. And so those two resources are crucial because there's so much information about the trees that they grow on their sites. So I felt like it was absolutely necessary to put those on here. So thank you so much for paying attention. I hope that you got some good information. Again, thank you to Roseville Utility Exploration Center. And do we have time for a few questions?
Yeah, Kevin, I think I can find maybe one or two. And then again, just so everybody remembers, we will grab all of these questions that you guys asked. There was a ton of good stuff coming in. We'll get all those answered, and then we'll send out a link to everybody that was here today that registered for this workshop on where to find those answers. But for right now, Kevin, we had one kind of early on that was talking about fruit tree suckers. They specifically asked, I have my fruit tree has suckers. I've cut them off, but they keep growing back. Is there anything I should do differently?
No, they do keep growing back. So that's totally normal. In some cases, a lot of sucker growth could be a sign that the tree is a little compromised, but not always. So I don't want to just absolutely jump to that conclusion. But you want to make sure that all your other cultural care elements are taken care of course. But no, your suckers, they pop up, and especially when they're from the rootstock, especially with citrus, because I see it over the last 18 years. You don't know how many times I have talked to people that say my citrus isn't producing fruit, or it's producing weird fruit or bad fruit that doesn't taste well. And almost every single time it can be traced back to the rootstock has overtaken the actual scion, the actual grafted variety. So with citrus, it's so crucial you do not let those suckers grow. But even on other trees, especially like apples and pears, my apple tree will put out, probably 60 or 70. It's a mature apple tree that I have to go and prune off. Now you can keep a few of those if you need to rejuvenate parts of the tree, because eventually they will produce spurs and fruit. But for the most part, you cut them all off, they come back, and you cut them off again.
Great. Let me see. I think they have one more. Trying to find it here.
Sure.
Oh, somebody asked about growing a fruit tree or growing a tree from a cutting. Specifically, what is the best time of year to start that?
So when you, again, like I talked about with the bare root fruit tree, it's a scion, the top part of the variety you want, grafted onto a rootstock. The rootstock conveys a lot of benefits, disease resistant, all sorts of different things. So it is a good idea to graft that cutting that you took onto a rootstock. And where do you get the rootstock? Well, we actually have some local growers, one in Placer County, Fowler's Nursery, one in Nevada County, Felix Gillet Institute, that could help you with that. If you just take a cutting and you root it, you will get that variety, true, but you don't get any of the benefits of the rootstock. And so, not that it wouldn't survive and potentially give you good fruit, but I would say I would go the extra step and graft that cutting onto a rootstock. And you would do that now is a great time to be doing that, is in the dormant time.
Great, Kevin. I think we'll just stop the questions at this point, just again in the name of time. So is there anything else you wanted to add in?
No, like I said, I know it's drink from a fire hose and get all this information. So please, 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 I highly encourage you to follow up on these with these resources and with the Master Gardener program and myself if you need to.
Great. Well, thank you again so much, Kevin, for coming out today and presenting just that ton of information and doing your best to kind of boil it down, like you said, into a roughly 45-minute program. Again, we will be posting this recording of this webinar on our webpage. I will be sending out emails to every participant that signed up for that link. Also, like I mentioned, we will take all of the questions, regardless of whether they got answered live or in the chat, and we'll repost all those questions with answers on that same webpage. Now, give us a little time, maybe about a week, to be able to get that up. But like I said, I will send out an email to everybody so you have access. You can come back, rewatch this presentation. If there's clips that maybe you wanted to listen to again, that'll be up and available for you as well. Now, I would like to say also that I will also be sending out a survey. We love to get some feedback from all of our participants. Lets us know what we did well, maybe what we should improve on. Also, there's a great section in there for topics. So if you wanted to hear more about any topic in particular, maybe it's about fruit trees, maybe it's about gardening, maybe it's about energy efficiency or water efficiency, anything really, just let us know. We do listen to those and make sure that we try and get information out that you guys are interested in hearing. On that topic, we do have another webinar scheduled on February 12th. Again, that's a Friday. It'll be at noon, and that's called Totally Tomatoes. So as you're looking forward into the season and you're thinking, man, I'd love to have some great tomatoes in my garden as well. Maybe you want a little brush up or a little more information. Join us for Totally Tomatoes on February 12th at noon. That's free registration for that, and that can also be found on our website. That's www.roseville.ca.us/explore. With that, guys, thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.